What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. We're going to find out today how gritty you are. Now, John, I see under your fingernails some
Yeah, I get a lot
dirt.
of grit.
Yeah, but I don't think that's what we're talking about. But John's a man of the earth.
The dogs get me gritty.
They get you gritty, and you put your hands in the soil, and a man of the land. That's what John Krosick is. I'm Larry Rifkin, and I don't have anything under my fingernails. No, because I don't know. I don't work as much with my hands, except playing my keyboard and my drums.
Get out there in the flower garden.
Yeah.
Talk to it.
Yeah, talk to the garden. Well, I got to tell you, we talked to a woman who has really tended a new garden in America that's gotten so much attention, John. And she's a remarkable woman, Dr. Angela Duckworth. And the book, of course, is called Grit. Now, we did an interview with her on radio several years back when Grit came out. And we thought that, well, it would be a good time to update what's going on with this phenomenon that she has built. I think when she did a TED Talk, John, there were about 14 million people who went up to take a look at it. Right. She has been lecturing and doing more research about perseverance and passion as being a great indicator of ultimate success. And it's not just the brain power that you were born with.
You think about it in hindsight and people I've known and stuff, actually her theory or whatever you want to call it is kind of like common sense, really. I mean, it's the people who really don't get knocked down and don't take it to heart and just keep coming back. Those people are successful.
Well, you can tell the people who continue to play that Frank Sinatra song, that's life. I pick myself up and get back in the race. But truly, she said it's not only those who have perseverance. I think what I found surprising when we talked to her again is that she said passion is oftentimes a harder component to come by than perseverance.
Right. Well, if what did Mark Twain say? If you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life.
And, well, John, somehow I think I've ascribed to that because I've never worked a day in my life. And I just collect a check. No. But seriously, passion, meaning that there's something that you really either explored and found or somebody brought to your attention, and you're so committed, so devoted to it, that it begins to crowd out other things because you are determined and you just love it. And I'll tell you lately, as much as I've come to it late in life, there are certain days that I can sit now at the keyboard, even though I'm not terribly good at it, and I find a couple of melodic riffs that just take me away, and I'll just keep working at it and finding if there's a song in there or whatever. And it's because you just get a passion about something that makes you feel so good when you're able to accomplish something in relation to it.
Yeah, that's great. Keep at it.
Well, I'm going to, John.
Use your grit.
I can't. There's no keyboard here, John. There's just a microphone, which you and I have been involved with for so many years, and that's another passion of ours.
Yes.
Why are we doing a podcast? We're not making a lot of money, but we love exploring new topics, learning ourselves, and sharing that with you.
Absolutely. It's good.
It is. So we're going to learn more and find out what is going on, particularly in a time, and I asked her a question that I think she really appreciated, one about all the dislocation. So you find that you are passionate about some occupation or avocation, and then all of a sudden, because of technology and because of all the changes in the dynamics within our culture, you realize that you're being displaced. What does that do for your own grit? And then it really forces you once again to find something else. Well, I guess that is, I hate to use the term, but true grit.
That was a great movie.
All right. Well, this is a great book and a great researcher, Dr. Angela Duckworth. And the topic is grit. More grit on America Trends. Well, the book is called Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. It's not only a book, but it's also a lot of psychological research that has gone into this, and it's a real phenomenon across the country. Angela Duckworth, did you realize at the time that you began exploring this concept of grit that it would catch on the way that it has and have as many adherents and so much interest?
To be honest, I had no idea. It was my husband who suggested gently and then forcefully that I write a book in the first place, and he was convinced that people would want to read it, but I guess he was right.
Absolutely. Why is it that you think this concept has caught on? Is it because a lot of people were excluded thinking, well, I don't have, the sharpest mind. I don't have the highest IQ. Therefore, I'm going to be excluded from some of the opportunities in America. And you've opened up another avenue of thought about success?
I do get emails and sometimes phone messages from people who are actually very successful now, but, it was a very rocky road and a long road getting there. And they will tell me, now I have a name for who I am. Now I know, based on the science, how I got to be where I got to be and who I got to be. So I think you're exactly right about that. And I just want to also say that I think that people are generally ambitious. Ambition, I used to think when I was growing up, well, maybe like 1 out of 100 people, maybe 1 out of 100 people is ambitious and the 99 of us are not. But really, I think everybody wants to do something with their life and to achieve something with their time here on the planet.
Well, you tell us and remind us, even in your TED Talk some years back, that a lot of the folks who really are measured for potential success are natural learners. I mean, on some level, they just have a high IQ. It comes easily to them. And I don't want to exclude them from this conversation by any means, but can you develop bad habits if you think everything comes so easily that you don't have to work terribly hard to attain?
I think when things go really, really well early in your life, maybe you're really smart and maybe you're really athletically gifted. It's actually that you don't get a lot of practice with failing. You don't get a lot of practice with being below average even. And that means that the first time it happens to you, maybe it happens when you're 18, maybe it happens when you're 22, it's really hard for you to take. And I like to call these, in some ways lucky and in some ways unlucky individuals, fragile perfects, because a lifetime of perfection does not set you up for dealing with imperfection very well. So indeed, it can be a blessing to not be the fastest, smartest person because you do get more tries at bat at this thing called failure and, resilience.
Chip on our shoulder, if we thought about that concept, or I really want to prove to somebody that I am more or better than they might have imagined, given my innate skills. And I know that I can work at this and I know I can get better. But you remind us that it's not only that. I mean, you just have to have a passion for something and you have to do the long marathon, not just the sprint. So how do we know that we really have those traits of grit?
The passion part of grit, I think, is the harder part. Perseverance sounds like the half of grit that we would all struggle with, work ethic, taking feedback, being resilient when bad things happen. Perseverance is hard, but I think passion is even harder, at least for a lot of the people that I've been talking to lately. They would be happy to work hard at something if they only knew what that something was. Now, how do you develop a passion? I'm really careful to use that word develop and not discover passion because I don't think it happens all at once like a discovery might. I think it can take years to gradually figure out something that you will be curious about, want to keep learning about, and also will find that resonates with your personal values, your morals. And when you have that combination of interest and purpose, you will have a passion in full flower. But it doesn't happen overnight. It can take a lot longer than a lot of people expect.
Do you worry that a lot of the AI, I mean, the last time I talked to you, I don't think artificial intelligence or automation or disruption in the workplace was quite as prevalent as it is today. Do you worry that some people may have a passion for what they have developed as a skill or an occupation, and then they're thrust into something else altogether? I mean, that's where you really have to show your grit, that now I have to start all over again. Do you worry that somebody's passion, if it's not in any way compensated or appreciated any longer, that we might fall victim to losing our confidence?
That is a really important question, especially given that it's already happening in some industries. Artificial intelligence isn't exactly a 2018 threat for a lot of industries, but it's certainly coming. And even if you look at healthcare and, say, print media or journalism, there are a lot of out-of-work journalists, and there are a lot of people in healthcare who now have to deal with, basically healthcare has become very corporate, right? And that's a change for nurses and doctors who maybe grew up in a completely different era. So it's a great question. I would recommend this. When you look into your heart and you say, why do I find meaning in my work? It's often a very kind of abstract thing. I like to help people. I believe that, physical health is important. I believe in words and in sharing stories. You could do it yourself, by the way. So it's an exercise that I think shows you that the particulars of your industry, the kind of specific way in which you're doing that today, well, maybe it does look very different in a year or more, but that higher level goal that brought you to this may not change. And so you might be more flexible, in fact, and more resilient in the face of these industry changes and transformations when you realize, the ultimate reason why you're involved is not going to change.
Do you think that there are still a lot of people out there skeptical about the notion that, in fact, grit and your perseverance and your passion combined to take a long-term view of something, that it's a better predictor of success in both the classroom and the workplace, that there are still a lot of skeptics who say, no, I mean, that's just a brainiac or a technical wizard, and that's why they've achieved all that they have?
I want to say that, not everyone agrees with me, and it's fair to actually disagree. And I think that's what makes my research and not just, not here to tell everybody that I have all the answers. So other scientists could disagree with me. I think that there are other things that matter to success in life. So, for example, emotional intelligence, being able to read other people, how are they feeling, and then being able to use that information and manage the situation. That's really important. When I say that grit is important, it doesn't mean that things like emotional intelligence or, artistic ability or other things aren't also really important. So that's one thing to say. I think sometimes people think, grit is being touted as the only thing that matters, and that's certainly not the case. I guess I'll also just say that there are other things like self-control that are pretty related to grit, but not exactly grit. And so this may not interest all of your listeners, but, some scientists want to say like, oh, well, do we have the right name for it? But I stand by my original research that suggests that in the long run, when you look at people who change the world and do great things, it is this combination of passion and perseverance extended over long, long stretches of time that really make an enormous difference.
I know when I first spoke to you, I was really fascinated with one of the subject, areas and the topic of West Point military cadets when you studied them. And I said to you, I think at the time, to me, it seems like they're all destined for success. And you were really looking for those who were going to break out of the pack and put them against this grit scale that has been developed. What was it about West Point? Because we think of all of the folks who go there as being remarkable just to get in.
They really are. Getting into West Point is a 2-year process. These are very often valedictorians or salutatorians, number 1 or number 2 in their entire high school class. They're almost always varsity athletes. And then they're often varsity athlete captains. And many, many, many women and men at West Point are varsity captains of 3 sports, while also being valedictorian or salutatorian. And the list goes on, right? Eagle Scout, et cetera. So they're remarkable young people. That doesn't mean that they don't struggle on bad days. And I think psychologically, one of the challenges of West Point, and when I describe it, I think it'll be familiar to people who haven't gone through something like West Point, but maybe something that is similar psychologically. When you are really good at what you do and you suddenly find yourself among a lot of people who are really good, And so maybe you're below average for the first time in your life. Maybe you're struggling for the first time in your life. I think that's what makes West Point so hard, that these women and men have been so accomplished for so long that, the first time they really face struggle, it's a doozy. It's hard for them. But we've all experienced that at some point, the first day of high school, or, maybe your first day on the job. And that psychological challenge, I think, is why grit predicts finishing that first hard summer training, and in fact, of course, finishing all 4 years at West Point.
Were you surprised at all that you really were able to predict using your grit scale who those people were? I mean, did it even take you aback? Because this was when you were first starting out with your research.
I wasn't entirely surprised, because when I approached West Point and suggested the idea of adding the grit scale to the battery of measures that cadets would take on day 2 of, the second day of arriving, the day that all the guys get their crew cuts, I suggested it because I thought it would predict. I think what's been remarkable to me, and this is just recent in terms of discovering this, West Point's been giving the grit scale pretty much every year since I started research with them. One of the benefits of working with the military, I guess, is they tend to do what they did last year. And this finding that grit predicts showing up and sticking it out through that first summer of training holds up year after year after year, even though West Point in general is letting more cadets stay in for that first summer. They used to have a pretty high dropout rate, about 25% in 1975, dropping down to about 1% today. Sure, lots of listeners will have thoughts about whether that's a good or a bad thing, but grit continues to be a predictive indicator.
Are there any areas where grit has been applied that you were even surprised that they're taking this scale and using it in a certain occupation or field of endeavor that you might not have imagined?
Well, when I first started working on these items for the grit scale, they came from interviews, just like the one you and I are having right now, when people are telling their stories of how they got to be where they are. Also, by the way, people that they admired in their field, and the stories of the kind of the most admired peers and their success. So when I started using the grit scale in research, I never really thought about what it could be used for outside of research. One day I start talking to a soccer coach named Anson Dorrance. He ends up being in my book because he is arguably the winningest soccer coach in history. And he has, won more NCAA championships than, possibly any coach in history, soccer or otherwise. And he told me he was giving the grit scale to his players, and he was using it actually as a tool for self-reflection and self-discovery. What does it mean to me to answer this scale today? Well, it means that I get to look in the mirror and say, how am I doing on passion and how am I doing on perseverance? So I think one of the most surprising applications for me is how people can take this questionnaire that was designed to do research and to use it as a way of learning more about themselves.
Do you worry that parents might misuse it? In other words, there are a lot of people who grew up and parents wanted them to play the piano and work on the scales and so forth. And they might have done it as an obligatory thing for a parent. And the parent might be accepting that as passion when in fact that's not necessarily their passion. It's almost drudgery, but they kind of masquerade it as something that, is wanted and desired on the part of their elders. How do you know that it's being applied appropriately? Because you don't suggest that for everything we do there should be a grit measurement necessarily.
No, I think the research can be misapplied. And, speaking about parents, I do often get these parents in the audience and they stand up and they say, Dr. Duckworth, it's a good thing, right, that I make my daughter practice piano 4 hours a day. And I say to that parent, because there's usually that parent, that it's not necessarily a good thing to force your child. In fact, if knowing nothing more, it's probably not a good thing. I do think kids will need parents. When they are young, they do need parents and coaches and teachers to provide some discipline, right? Because, I don't know the kid who would rather practice piano than sit on the couch and go through Snapchat feeds. So of course parents play a role in enforcing a little discipline, particularly when kids are younger. But I think the most important thing that parents miss is the idea of passion. If a kid feels like I'm doing this because my mom is making me, they are very unlikely to ever do things on their own. it's a completely different story if a kid says to you, like, I want to do piano. Now I'm going to need you to, help me be a little, hardworking when I don't feel like it, but it's my idea, at least a little bit. So I think that intrinsic motivation that comes at an early age, kids, it's not like you have to wait till they're 18. Even at age 5, kids can begin to start to say, like, I like this more than I like that. I think that's the biggest mistake that I see parents making.
What about as we get older? Because I found, we just did a podcast on the happiness curve and found that once we strip away some of these external rewards of achievement and recognition because it's our professional duty, and we get into learning again things that we want to do at an older age, but there's no outside pressure to do it. It's just something we've always wanted to do that we get great intrinsic value from. I mean, do you find that older learners really benefit from knowing that, wow, this is something I've got to work at, but boy, do I love this, and I wish I had explored it sooner?
We're living longer and longer, as a species. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but, it wasn't that long ago when, people would never even think about living and being vital into their 80s and beyond, which is a wonderful thing. And as we, live longer and healthier lives, it opens up the opportunity for grit looking very different than maybe it did when you were in your 30s. For a lot of people, they're going to pick up a hobby or an avocation of something that they started but maybe neglected because they were so busy working. And I do think that for many people, I was thinking about this, funny enough, last time I was watching the Great British Bake Off, and, none of those people are professional bakers, but they're obviously really gritty, and they're practicing, they're getting feedback, they're passionate, they're, thinking about desserts at night, they think about it when they wake up in the morning. That is grit, and it doesn't have to be your paid job that you express that.
And when you think about happiness and grit, do they go together? Because I love the way you were talking about it, that it's got to be the child's desire, not the parent's desire. So is there a linkage? Because I know in many college settings, the course that everybody gravitates to is the one about happiness. But do they come together in a wonderful meld?
Happiness and grit in my data are really tightly linked. In other words, grittier people in my research are happier and vice versa. Doesn't mean that every gritty person is guaranteed to be happy. It doesn't mean that every happy person is guaranteed to be gritty. But I do think that it's worth noting, in general, happiness tends to go along with a lot of other things that you want in life, like being gritty, like being reasonably accomplished. Students who get higher grades tend, on average, to be happier. That might go against people's stereotype. They might think that high achievers are miserable, or that really good students are stressed out all the time. But actually, in general, and again, of course, there are exceptions, good things tend to go together. And I think the lesson for us is that, if you have something that you're passionate about and you work hard and you're, learning and improving, it means that it's completely compatible with being satisfied overall with your life. And my guess is that they actually do contribute to each other, that pride, one of the people I interviewed in the book who's since become a good friend is Mark Vetri, a very renowned chef. And, I was in a cooking class with him, actually, after I had already completed the book. We were all learning to make, pasta and pesto. And one of the students in the class, a middle-aged woman, said, "Oh, I'm sorry, chef, I just have a question. Is this it? I mean, are we just learning to make pesto?" And he looked her in the eye and he said, "This pesto is going to be better than any pesto you've ever had." And she said, "Why?" And he said to her, "Because I know how to cook." And that pride that comes from doing something really well and earning that excellence, I think that is part of, not all of, a happy life.
It might be a benefit for those who are listening to break down for them the 4 traits that you need in abundance if you're going to be a paragon of grit: resilience, a willingness to engage in deliberate practice, passion, and a sense of purpose toward achieving a top-level goal. Now, people might wonder, do I really have that? I mean, I'm never going to be Nadal, and I'm never going to be in the U.S. Open, but I love tennis, and I keep working at it. But when I see that he just completed last night before we recorded this, another 5-hour match, and he said, I do it because I want to get to that next stroke. I want to see what I can do to put my opponent away. I mean, it takes such work. How do we know we've got these four and can become a paragon of grit, as you say?
There are two ways to compare yourself. The first is the obvious way, which is you look to your left, you look to your right, and you compare yourself to other people. Who's the fastest? Who's the smartest? Who's accomplished the most? And who's winning the most tennis matches? The other way that you can make comparisons is compare yourself to yourself. How am I today compared to how I was last week? How am I this year compared to last year? How is this game compared to the last game? And actually, the paradox of all of this is that most world champions, I think, are really mostly comparing themselves to their own past selves, as opposed to making comparisons to other people. It's often called, the path to mastery, trying to beat yourself. And I do think that is a healthier attitude. First of all, you don't have to be discouraged that you're not going to be Nadal, right? Okay, that's not the relevant comparison. The comparison is to your tennis game last year. And secondly, I think it means that essentially, you don't have to make someone lose in order for you to win.
And how do we begin to appreciate whatever the skill level that we can attain by virtue of working at it really hard, being determined, and having that passion? How do we accept that's where our natural abilities and our work ethic have brought us without comparing ourselves to others, perhaps?
The comparison to others is something that I don't want to say that, you should never do it. Of course, when you interview Olympic hopefuls, they would be lying if they said they didn't care about winning the gold, right? It's this funny combination where I think most of their time, most of their attention is, how am I today compared to how I was yesterday? Can I beat my own time? Can I PR? Can I create a personal record here? But some of the time, they are thinking about, how they stack up to others. So I don't want to be naive and say, we can completely ignore the competition or we can completely ignore comparisons to people around us. But I do think it's healthier if most of our attention goes to, how can I improve this stroke and what can I do tomorrow? I think in terms of reckoning with our place in life, where we are, for some of us, we exceeded expectations. I think for most of us, maybe the things that we thought we were going to do, they didn't pan out. A lot of life is luck and opportunity and beyond our control. I would say this, the people that I interview who are invariably happy are people who are very other-centered. So they use their passion and their perseverance in the service of other people. They're thinking about their church, their temple, their community, their neighborhood, their volunteering. They're thinking about concerns that are things that you can use grit to, get better at, but they're very, very purposeful in the sense of serving other people. And I think that is a great antidote. I haven't met the person who's really gritty in the service of other people who's unhappy and dissatisfied in that way that social comparisons can actually, get us sucked into.
How important, I would imagine, greater than ever, having this growth mindset that I know you have talked about in the past. And how do you know that you're really a person who's always looking to evolve and change and reflect a new reality about yourself, never accepting that, where you started is where you have to end up?
If Carol Dweck were here to talk about growth mindset, of course, Carol Dweck is the psychologist at Stanford who coined the term. She would say that in our heads, we have a growth mindset voice and a fixed mindset voice. So people that you would say, shorthand have a growth mindset are those who, get the growth mindset voice coming out more than the fixed mindset. But we all have a voice inside of us that says, I'll never be good at this. It's just not my thing. And so one thing to say is just to forgive ourselves for occasionally saying things that, might be more fixed than than growth oriented. Everyone, including Carol, has both voices in their head. But we do, I think, want to listen more to the, voice in us that says, like, there's something I can do here. Improvement is possible. I think that more than knowing whether you have enough of the growth versus fixed, I think just reflecting a little bit and maybe asking yourself, have I been in situations where I went in being a little more optimistic, a little more looking for where I could change, and how did that turn out? I think that reflection is helpful. Myself, I think about, for example, sports. I always say to my husband, and it's really fixed mindset. I say, like, oh yeah, I'm not an athlete. I'm not good at sports. And he says to me, like, well, since I've met you, you've been very athletic. You go to yoga. I took you rock climbing. You took to that pretty well. I think it's because when I was in elementary school, when we had to do those 600-yard dashes, I was always the slowest kid. I was always the one who was walking it in. And so I think I had this fixed mindset from childhood that, like, I'll never be good at sports, but I think I need to replace that childhood voice with my husband's voice that says, like, no, you're just as able to do athletic stuff as anybody else I've met.
This whole notion of grit, is it more effectively applied and taught and thought about in an American context because of the cult of the individual, and we always emphasize the potential of the individual, as opposed to any other society where that is not emphasized as much?
What a perceptive question. I think there is absolutely some cultural differences that, maybe you could say, for example, I'm Chinese, and I went recently to China and Taiwan to talk about grit. And, if you ask me a question, are there any cultural differences between China and Taiwan and the United States? I'll say, yes, there are definitely cultural differences. And the emphasis on the family and community as opposed to individual happiness is one of them. That said, there was a line around the block from, people who wanted to hear more about grit. And I think that means that it must be relevant there too. In fact, I think there may have been more copies of grit sold in Korea than like the whole eastern part of the United States combined. So I think that there's something universal about, this idea of, what you can do in your life. Maybe one difference would be that if you come from certain cultures, what you want to do with all that passion and perseverance is something which is much more community oriented versus individual. But in general, I think that human nature is human nature, when you cross borders and the food's different and certain things are different. I do think in many ways we're more similar than we are different.
I know that you have seen the application of grit in the education reform movement. Is there any particular area or endeavor where it has been applied that you are so thrilled with the results, or you think it's particularly effective as a measurement tool?
There's a study that was done in Turkey of kids who learned about grit and also growth mindset. And they found in that study that learning about that for several weeks with their teachers ended up producing gains over 2 years later on the academic achievement on standardized tests for those students. And the teachers were incredibly creative. They used their imagination. They made up things like they had the non-quitter of the week, and they would put the picture up of the student, not necessarily the student who got the highest marks that week, but a student who did something that was hard and they didn't quit. I love those applications. I like the idea of, some of these psychological insights making their way into classroom practice, making their way into family tradition, showing people what they can do. I think that's, to me, the most gratifying. I'm less enthusiastic about, using grit or mindset or other ideas and saying like, okay, well, now we're going to start measuring these things and having punishments for not having schools who are gritty enough. I think that it's more of a cultural change that I'm excited about.
In closing, Angela Duckworth, the author of Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance, this was all research-based. Where has your research gone since the book was published, and are you working on another book that might be even grittier?
Well, I am really interested in the goal hierarchy that I talk about in the book, and the idea that you could have a top-level goal, maybe 10 words or fewer, that defines what you're trying to accomplish with your life, and that under that you could have, okay, here's the 2 big projects that I would say, like for me, I want to be someone who helps kids thrive using psychological science. And I've got one big project. It's a nonprofit called Character Lab. I've got another big project, which is, my work as a scientist. And then I have goals under those. And this idea of creating a goal hierarchy, a pyramid of goals, I think is really powerful. And I'm excited to maybe help people do that and see what benefits there might be in terms of increasing their grit.
Well, thank you so much for coming by today on America Trends and sharing all of this knowledge and research with us and inspiring others. If you haven't read the book yet, it's still available in many forms, and you're even on the cover of Costco Connection. So you know,
I know so many people get that magazine.
it
Who
is
knew?
remarkable. It really is. Dr. Angela Duckworth, thank you for coming by today on America Trends.
Thank
Okay.
you. I really enjoyed the conversation.